The last week for Helldivers has led to a lot of pretty large-scale changes within the game. An almost complete overhaul of how heavy enemies and armor and AT work and interact with one another has gone through, on top of a massive balance patch that has buffed a ton of weapons across the board. Then on top of that, a new gas warbond has come out, adding even more new toys into the mix. With how this patch has overall been received very positively by a lot of players, I expect that this is going to be the new standard of balance for Helldivers 2. And as such, I want to take today talking about the weapons that are in the game and either didn't get changed or didn't get changed enough, and as such have fallen down in terms of how capable they are. The devs have said that within the next 30 days, there's going to be another patch, and I'm hoping that that can round out, because overall, I think that a lot of weapons are currently viable, like more than has been in quite a while in terms of being legitimately powerful options, but there's still a handful of these kind of bottom-of-the-barrel options that need some more love to really be worthwhile on higher difficulties. Let's kick things off by talking about primaries, and the first one we're going to talk about is the Penetrator. The Penetrator got some pretty significant buffs with its damage going up by 15 in the last patch. This has been a very positive change, but there's one single issue with it that keeps it from being good. The Adjudicator is just a better version. It has more damage and better long-range performance while still having the same amount of bullets per magazine. Technically, the Penetrator does have more reserve magazines, but it just doesn't really make the Penetrator stand out when you can have a more efficient and more lethal option. As such, I want to suggest turning the Penetrator even closer to that of the base Liberator. And as such, I'm going to suggest it gets the same magazine, so 45 rounds per magazine, up from its current 30. On top of that, I'm also going to suggest then removing 3 of the reserve magazines. These changes essentially will keep the total ammo of the Penetrator about the same, but it leaves the Penetrator in a role that it is much better at dispatching light enemies without needing to do as frequent of reloading. I believe this wouldn't cause any issues with the base Liberator, as the base Liberator would still have an additional reserve magazine and 10 more damage per shot, giving it overall an even better chaff-clearing killing potential, whereas the Penetrator instead has that extra armor piercing of 3. On top of that, the Adjudicator would now have its own niche of the more marksman-based rifle, while the Penetrator is a bit more of a generalist. Moving on, let's talk about the Liberator Concussive, another weapon that got a pretty significant buff by having its regular magazine turned into a drum magazine of 60 rounds. And this has been a very nice change. It feels a lot more capable of keeping enemies or even small groups of enemies stunned by just repeatedly shooting into them. However, I still believe the concussive is not worth it really because it lacks a bit of time to kill potential on top of also having some weird bullet spread that makes it fairly inaccurate at longer ranges. My suggestions are going to be essentially addressing those. So the first thing is, well, reducing the bullet spread, making this just a bit more accurate at mid to long ranges so bullets aren't randomly missing as much, should help to make this weapon a bit more well-rounded. On top of that, I'm also going to suggest increasing its rounds per minute by 60, meaning it would have about a 380 round per minute fire rate. This is still notably quite slow. For reference, the Pummeler, which has also a stun mechanic, has about 480 RPM, meaning that it would still shoot quite a bit faster, but just this small bump might be enough to make the concussive feel like even better and like a legitimate and very reliable, stunning primary. Next up, let's talk about shotguns. The Breaker Spray and Pray is a weapon that got a buff that it has needed for a long time to its damage, and that has been very nice. However, there is one thing about the Breaker Spray and Pray that also needs adjustments for it to really ascend to a great position, and that is fixing the handling. For those that don't know, every weapon in the game essentially has a handling mechanic, which decides how quickly you can turn that weapon and aim it where you want to. This is why, for example, something like the heavy machine gun or autocannon feel like they are a bit more sluggish as they have worse handling. The Breaker Spray and Pray has really poor handling, I believe the worst of all the primaries. So I'm going to simply suggest improving this handling. In fact, we have a weapon that already feels really good, the Incendiary Breaker, and I'm going to suggest simply making the handling the exact same as the Incendiary Breaker. A nice little buff that should be good quality of life for the gun. And speaking of the Incendiary Breaker, let's talk about that gun. Pretty much the thing that started this whole month and a half worth of balance changes and whatnot since Escalation of Freedom. Simply put, the Incendiary Breaker is a weapon that did need a nerf because the gun is too good at doing everything, but the way it got changed was a bad one that doesn't fix the issues and made everybody upset. So I'm going to give a suggestion to rebalance the gun in a soft rework. So to start with the positives, I'm going to suggest giving back the 2 magazines that it lost in Escalation of Freedom. And on top of that, I also want to suggest a sort of OCD change, which is give it 1 more shell per magazine so it matches the Breaker Spray and Pray. It bugs me to no end that these are not the same. But it's overall a very, very tiny change that can barely be called a buff. However, to get that ammo back, it does need to lose a bit of pellet damage. Keep in mind that the pellets still ignite enemies, meaning they still are taking an additional 200-250 damage from the fire. And as such, this change is mostly focused on just making it a little bit weaker in terms of mag dumping into an enemy, which is in line with a weapon like the Cookout, which does less damage per shot, but makes up for it with that additional capability of setting enemies on fire. To be specific, I'm suggesting to lower the regular pellet damage down to 13 per pellet, essentially a net loss of about 30 damage. And then also, I'm suggesting the durable damage from the pellets go down to about 3 per pellet. This would be about 50 durable damage per shot, which is a lot more in line with other shotguns, like the regular Spray and Pray and whatnot. The result is hopefully that the Incendiary Breaker remains an extremely potent crowd control tool, able to annihilate entire groups of enemies in just a couple shots, but it's a little bit less effective against things like mediums and heavies, where other shotguns with their higher damage can come in and have a slightly better performance. Then, adding the ammo back should hopefully make people not as constricted when they take it, allowing it to be used much more liberally. I understand this might be still a controversial series of changes, but I do think this would be the best way to make the Breaker strong, but not overshadowing all the other shotguns in the game like it did in the past. For the final couple weapons of primaries, let's talk about energy weapons, starting off with the Sickle. Now, the Sickle is a weapon that has been kind of considered like one of the best automatic weapons in the game for a while, and I still think it's very close to that. However, with the last patch, I think the lower damage of the Sickle has left it a little bit behind the other assault rifles in terms of performance. I want to suggest a very, very tiny change of 5 additional damage to it, just so it kind of keeps up with the other assault rifles, but I wouldn't want to go overboard as this is still very strong as an infinite ammo assault rifle. The bigger weapon we need to talk about is the Purifier, a weapon that actually, if you know how to use it and can use it effectively, is actually a fairly good weapon. The problem with it is mostly that it just doesn't feel that good to use when you are, having to charge up shots and manage that on top of aiming at enemies and whatnot. It just doesn't have enough payoff compared to what you are putting into it, and it feels cumbersome because of that. My suggestion is to essentially turn it into closer to of an automatic gun. Essentially, if you hold down the fire button, it will charge up a shot, and when the shot is ready to go, it will immediately fire it and begin charging another one. This would make it a lot closer to something like a pump-action shotgun like the Plasma Punisher, which is a weapon that feels really good to use. So hopefully this change would make the Purifier feel a lot better. However, on top of that, I also would like to see a very small change in that the projectile itself deals an extra 50 damage. This would allow the Purifier to more effectively snipe weak points on things like Devastators, as it would have enough damage to one-shot them. But just the projectile itself, not the explosion from it, as it would be a bit too strong if it got explosion buffs as well. Moving on to secondaries, I actually only have a single suggestion here, as all the primaries got buffs or were already really good before the patch. The Peacemaker got one additional magazine in this last patch, and I don't think that's nearly enough for the Peacemaker. Simply put, the verdict is just a better Peacemaker at the moment in every single case, and if you don't want a generalist pistol, all the specialized ones exist. So the Peacemaker needs to have some sort of generalist role that is appealing to use. My suggestion is essentially taking what happened in the small buff and just making it a lot more impactful. I'm suggesting to give it an additional 3 reserve magazines, up to a grand total of 9. On top of that, I'm also suggesting to add a reload speed increase of about half a second. This would overall make the Peacemaker a far more reliable sidearm, with tons of reserve ammo, about 120 bullets in total, on top of about a 1-second reload, allowing you to very quickly pull it out, empty it into an enemy, and reload it ready to go. It needs to just have that utility of lots of ammo that never runs out, as that is kind of the only niche it could possibly fill. The devs were already onto that buff. I think they just need to go a bit farther in order to really make it worth considering as your sidearm. Then, moving on to throwables, this is a category that I think actually does need quite a few number of changes, as it's still sort of dominated by only the best of the best in them. Notably, a lot of the non-impact regular grenades need more improvement, starting off with fragmentation grenades. Now, frag grenades did get a buff. They got 1 additional grenade, fragmentation improvements, but I still think they overall are just not as good as they could be. And I'm going to suggest giving them 1 additional grenade, meaning that you would have a base of 6 of them to use. This would make them extremely reliable and a bit more spammable in terms of their overall usefulness. They can only really kill chaff-sized enemies and close up bug holes or destroy fabricators. So having an extra grenade in order to help keep clearing squads, I think, would be a very nice little bump, again, to just keep these as like kind of a utility one. Next up is the High Explosive Grenade. Simply put, the High Explosive Grenade is a worse version of the Impact Grenade. It has a nearly 4-second long fuse for the same damage and practically, and for most purposes, the exact same explosion. I think this needs to be adjusted, and the HE Grenade simply needs more damage. I'm suggesting a 50% increase in both its regular and durable damage, meaning it would deal 600 damage. This should be enough that it is able to kill pretty much any light or medium enemy that it explodes on, which I think is worthwhile because it's got a very long fuse time, meaning that you really have to bait your enemies or predict where they're going to be in order for it to be lethal. This would really help to make the HE Grenade something different than the Impact that is kind of currently like the meta explosive grenade. The regular incendiary grenades kind of have a similar issue in that the impact version of them is just the same thing but no fuse time, and therefore is just significantly better. My suggestions are going to follow in the HE grenades, so I'm going to suggest that the explosion has an extra 100 damage on it, so it's a bit more lethal up front, and then I'm also going to suggest that the flame left on the ground has the pool increased. Something like a 25 to 30% increase in the size would make it that the incendiary grenade is a bit more punchy and also is a bit better at area denial compared to the impact, which should help offset that fuse time that it is stuck with. Smoke grenades are unable to kill enemies and instead offer a utility in that they are smoke. Now, the way smoke works in Helldivers 2 is that it reduces the sight of enemies significantly when they are inside of it, meaning that you are able to essentially break aggro when using smoke grenades. However, smoke grenades, I think, have a bit of an issue where they are just not doing enough of this in order to really make it worth taking them. I'm going to suggest increasing the size of the smoke cloud created by about 40% or so. This would make it that the smoke cloud is very legitimately able to, like, close off an area and allow you to break away from groups of enemies. There have been times when I've been using this that I tried to break away from enemies, but because the smoke cloud is too small, sometimes the enemies will spot you, relock on aggro, and you've essentially done nothing and have to either use another grenade or actually fight. A larger smoke grenade should help to give them that better utility that they are meant to be in. And the final throwable are throwing knives. Throwing knives are going to be the one weapon that I think needs just kind of a full-on rework with a new mechanic in order to make them worthwhile. As it currently stands, throwing knives are single target, low damage options that they don't do anything. They offer no benefits. You're actively making yourself worse by taking them. And if you could take nothing in the grenade slot, it'd be about the same thing as taking the throwing knives. So I'm going to suggest across the board buffs to these things. So I'm going to suggest increasing the base damage to 500, a doubling of the current damage that it does. On top of that, durable damage should go up by 200, making it 3 times as deadly when hitting durable parts. This essentially puts it on par with a lot of the other grenades in terms of their damage, but is still only single target, and it only has armor piercing 3, meaning that you're not going to be able to damage heavies with it. But that is not all, because like a lot of people have suggested, I think throwing knives need to improve your melee. There should legitimately just be a knife that you can use to stab people and increase your damage and performance with melee. It fits with the armor perks, it fits with just the overall theme of it. It really should be there. My suggestion is the knife does something like make your melee damage closer to 200, 250, and then give you penetration 3. This means that 1 or 2 melees would be able to kill pretty much all light enemies would pretty much be killed in one shot, and most medium enemies could be killed in maybe 2 or 3 melees, which if you're getting that close to groups of enemies to stab them, I think is totally justifiable in being allowed to. Moving on to the stratagems, one thing that I would like to see is not a specific change, but in general, if there is a backpack-based weapon that has a team reload, I would really like to see it that you don't need to have the same backpack in order to make it work. Essentially, if either player has a backpack, you should be able to join together in order to have that increased fire rate and reload speed. It's a very cool mechanic that is interesting co-op-wise, but I don't see it a whole lot because people are generally running their own stratagems and weapons. So it'd just be nice that, especially for random lobbies and whatnot, if you could just use another person's backpack in order to reload more effectively, and you would be able to see this in action more. Moving on to the actual stratagem weapons, the first thing I want to talk about is the Airburst rocket launcher. The Airburst rocket launcher overall is a weapon that I think mainly lacks in its ability to kill medium enemies. I've had, in playing with it, especially even post-patch, that you sometimes will just shoot into a crowd of the medium-sized enemies, like Devastators or Brood Commanders, and they just kind of randomly survive it and walk away not dead, which feels wrong. So my suggestion is to increase the damage of the first split bombs. Essentially, the Airburst has 3 explosions. The initial explosion from the rocket you shoot, it splits into these medium-sized bombs, which then split into mini-bombs. I'm suggesting that the medium-sized bombs get a damage increase. Something like 150 extra damage or so would put them to about 400 damage, which should be far more reliable in killing those medium-sized enemies if they're close to the initial explosion area, which hopefully will just make them feel better. The jump pack is not a weapon, but is still something that I think needs improvements overall. Notably, it is something that is one of the few mobility tools within Helldivers 2, but we got essentially a better version when we went to Meridia with the dark matter fluid that allowed you to jump even higher and more effectively. In all honesty, this would be what I changed. Just make the dark matter fluid, take whatever stats those were, and put them on the regular jump pack. It would essentially allow you to jump higher and just overall feel really good. On top of that, I also want to suggest removing the accuracy penalty when jumping, because right now, if you jump and try to shoot at anything, you're not able to hit the broadside of a barn, which it's really cool to do this jump and then gun stuff down as you land, but that's currently not very feasible. So this would be another nice little change for the jump pack. The Guard Dog Ballistic is a weapon that needs some more adjustments to it. Notably, I'm going to suggest increasing its damage again, as it uses a Liberator and has consistently been buffed whenever the Liberator does, and it didn't this time around. So I'm suggesting to give it 10 additional damage per bullet, increase its lethality a bit, make it a bit better, but I also want to suggest having a change to some of its priorities, because currently the Guard Dog Ballistic tends to shoot at enemies that it can't effectively damage, and it leads to it wasting ammunition and then going to reload instead of dealing with smaller, easier to kill enemies. I'd like to see some property changes just to make sure it's only really shooting at stuff it can effectively handle, because that would also help to make it feel more useful. The final stratagem weapon is the new Sterilizer. Now, the Sterilizer is, I think, the worst of the gas options currently in-game. And the reason for this is that you have to have the Sterilizer not only as your stratagem weapon, but also you have to equip it and then actively be shooting it in order to apply the gas effect. All three other effects, the Orbital Strike, the Dog Breath, and the gas grenades, can be used alongside pretty much any other weapon, and it makes them much easier to use on their own. Currently, the Sterilizer doesn't do that and makes it feel more restrictive than I think it should. Now, there's only so much to be done about how it's designed, but I think it needs just a little bit of damage added to the main gas stream. For those that don't know, the current Sterilizer does exactly 1 damage if you're directly shooting at something, on top of the 25 damage per second of the gas effect. That is simply pitiful, and it's the reason why enemies are able to kind of just walk through, even if you're directly shooting at them, and they can hit you and kill you. It's because it doesn't deal any damage. So I'd like to see a little bit of damage added onto the gas stream that you're shooting, so that if you're focus firing something, you get a bit more damage, and you're able to clear out things like lighter enemies or even mediums with a little bit of focus fire. I don't want to make it another flamethrower, but I would like to see that change. On top of that, I also wouldn't be opposed to seeing a range increase, as just having more range to cover makes it easier to keep groups of enemies sort of stunned and blinded with the gas. Moving on to our final topic, let's talk about the stratagem call-in, starting with the Orbital Precision Strike. The OPS was buffed pretty much every patch, in that it got better and better with more aggressive cooldowns. It was very efficient at killing heavy enemies if you could aim it right. However, the recent patch ended up adjusting enemy health values in a way that the OPS doesn't really one-shot enemies anymore. You have to land a direct hit in order to reliably kill things. And even then, several enemies are able to just outright survive it. So I'm going to suggest a damage buff up to about 4,500 damage for the projectile. This would ensure that it's pretty much insta-killing anything that isn't like a factory strider. And on top of that, I also suggest the AoE damage gets increased to about 1,500. This would make it so that the OPS is kind of back to where it was previously. You can pretty much delete almost any heavy enemy with it if you aim it well. And the AoE increase is just so it's more reliable in heavily wounding heavies if it misses. In that same vein, the Orbital Rail Cannon Strike is a call-in that has kind of been bad for a long time. With a 3-minute cooldown and it only being able to kill one heavy, it just really isn't worth it. On top of that, again, enemies got health buffs and changes that have made it so the rail cannon can't even kill certain enemies anymore. So this just needs across-the-board buffs. I'm suggesting 2 relatively large buffs First off, the damage should go all the way up to 10,000. This would mean the rail cannon should, in theory, be able to instantly kill a factory strider when used against it. And on top of that, I'm suggesting to remove a full minute off of its cooldown. With stuff like the 500 kilogram bomb and the Orbital Precision Strike, hopefully once it gets buffed, the rail cannon really needs to be the ultimate anti-heavy, and killing one heavy every 2 minutes with the new AT balance I think is totally fine, as the rail cannon has that one job and it needs to be the best at doing it to be even halfway worth considering. The final offensive-based stratagem I want to talk about is the Orbital Laser. Now, the Orbital Laser actually did get a buff this patch, raising it to about 600 damage per second, about double of what it had before. However, this, kind of like the Orbital Precision Strike and the Orbital Rail Cannon Strike, it overall doesn't have the damage that it needs to deal with the bigger heavies anymore. And simply put, I'm suggesting another buff to the Orbital Laser. Going from 600 damage, I'd like to see its base damage go up to 1,000. On top of that, I'd also like to see the durable damage go from 600 up to about 850. This would put it in hopefully a lethal enough position that it's able to pretty much delete anything and everything, which it really needs to because it's got a massive cooldown on it and also has a limit of 3 uses per mission. So this needs to be probably one of the strongest stratagems in raw power, limited by the time you can't really spam it. Keep in mind that things like the Orbital Napalm and the 380mm barrage have unlimited uses and similar cooldowns, and I would say they're probably still way more lethal than the Orbital Laser is currently. There are also a handful of support options that I feel need to be talked about as well, starting out with the Orbital EMS Strike. As it currently stands, the Orbital EMS Strike is able to pretty much stun the vast majority of enemies. However, certain heavy enemies are able to sort of ignore its ability to stagger them, which means that they're able to continue attacking until the stun sets in. I'm suggesting that all enemies, if they are hit in that initial explosion, should become staggered. It's a small change, but it should make the EMS a lot better at pacifying enemies that are actively attacking you and stopping things like chargers from rushing in or stopping like automaton tanks from shooting at you. Also, similar to the smoke grenades, I think the Eagle Smoke Strike and the Orbital Smoke Strike both need further adjustments. So the Eagle Smoke Strike, I think, is the best smoke ability overall, but I personally believe you could probably give it one extra usage without any real issue. This would just allow you to use it even more liberally without needing to reload as often. It should be a very small but noticeable buff. On top of that, the Orbital Smoke Strike, I think, needs a cooldown reduction. Down by 22 seconds would put it at the lowest possible recharge time of about a minute. On top of that, similar to the smoke grenade, I want to see this have the cloud expanded by about 25%. This would just make it easier to break off from enemies because, kind of like the regular smoke grenades, this thing has one big smoke plume and enemies can sometimes see it if there's large groups of them and you're trying to retreat. Making it a bit larger just makes that a bit easier, especially because this is also a stratagem, meaning it's taking up one of your 4 slots. It should be very, very strong in giving you smoke. On top of that, I also want to suggest that these 2 stratagems, they do not alert enemies when you throw them. These are supposed to help you, like, prevent fights or break away from fights, but currently, if you throw this stratagem near enemies, like all stratagems, it will alert them to you attacking them and they will aggro onto you. So by removing that, it makes it easier to, say, throw this at the edge of an enemy base that you don't want to get into a fight, or at a patrol, smoke the position, the enemies won't be able to see you, and you're able to successfully get out of there. The final stratagems I want to talk about for today are the minefields. All 3 minefields, I think, currently just lack the impact they need because of one big factor. They are a hazard to both the enemies and to you. It makes them very awkward to use, as you can't really use them on objectives, you can't really use them willy-nilly, and they have a long cooldown on top of that. My suggestion is to start out by making them no longer trigger on Helldivers, and then also reducing their cooldown by about 30 seconds, making it a 2-minute cooldown. By making them not trigger on Helldivers, I think it makes Minefields way easier to use in general. You're able to essentially throw them down to damage and kill enemies that are like chasing you without turning the entire map into a death zone where people are constantly triggering them and dying, which is, again, just kind of like the big issue with it. It still might not be enough, even with an additional cooldown buff, but I think it would be a very positive step in the right direction, and then it would just be a thing of adjusting the damage, maybe how far the mines are spread, or even just reducing the cooldown further. But I think this one change would just go a long way into getting Minefields into a much more usable state. And with that, that is all I'm going to talk about. Quite a lot of changes. If you've watched all the way to the end, I want to thank you so much for watching. I plan to do more Helldivers 2 content in the future, so like and subscribe if you don't want to miss out on that and giving my thoughts and stuff like this. But otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a good day.